Bom dia a todos. Eu sou Hugo Aguilani, eu sou diretor do Instituto Serrapilheira. Fico muito feliz hoje de ter o Simon Levin, da Princeton University, conosco. Eu só quero lembrar que esse seminário está sendo organizado conjuntamente com o ICTP-SAIFR, da Unesp, em São Paulo, e nós vamos ter hoje o Simon Levin, e na quinta-feira a Akiko Iwasaki, que também vai falar sobre outros assuntos científicos. Eu vou agora apresentar o Simon, e eu vou passar pelo inglês, porque eu acho bom que ele entende o que a gente está falando. So, switching to English now, it is, of course, my enormous pleasure to host Simon Levin. It's very difficult to present Simon, but he's a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at Princeton University. He's the director of the Center for Biocomplexity, and when you go to his website, you could find what he calls a short CV, which is probably much longer than any CV, normal CV, for most of us. But, you know, so I could tell you that Simon has published hundreds of papers, received many prizes, amongst them the Kyoto Prize, the Heineken Prize, the National Medal of Science, the Tyler Prize for Environment, and many others. But when you look at what he's done, I think that's what's most stimulating, and I think that's what made us get in touch at first. Simons is a mathematician by training and became an ecologist. He likes complex things. He goes from spatial ecology, he studies patterns and scales. He goes from studies dynamic of biological diversity, and he does that at all scales. So that means that he goes from the molecular aspects of things to ecosystems. He even goes to economics and pays attention to cultural aspects. So this is the type of sciences that I think is inspiring to see for young people, especially because the span of curiosity and attention and capacity that he has to study very variable things is absolutely extraordinary. And so Simon is part of the scientific advisory board of the Serrapilheira Institute. He's been extremely helpful in helping us to designing the way we do things, and he's specifically part of the advisory board of the training program that we're launching today, which is a biology and ecology quantitative program, again, together with ICTP. Of course, Simon is a very busy man, but even being busy, he's extremely available. He always responds. He's been extremely present in our exchanges, and it's been very inspiring to work with him and to design the program that we are launching today. He's of course immensely known for the work he's done on ecology, but really he's a complete scientist, and I think he's a scientist. He's a type of scientist that we'd like to the type of scientists that we'd like to train here in Brazil together with ICTP. So it makes total sense to have Simons with us today. He will tell us about mathematical ecology. The title of his lecture is A Century of Progresses and Challenges for the Next Century. So I guess he will bring us a large overview of what he's been doing for decades in the fields of mathematical ecology. So Simon, thank you very much for being here, spending a little bit of your day today with us. It's extremely inspiring for us to have you here. Again, thank you very much for helping us out to put things together at Serrapilheira with ICTP. and I'll hand the mic to you. I just want to tell the public that you can ask some questions at the end of Simon's talk. We'll have time for a few questions. So as you write your questions, they will be transmitted to me, and I will ask these questions to Simon. And I have to remind you that on March 9th is the day where we'll open inscriptions for our training program. Simon, please be my guest. I hand the mic to you. Thank you again for your presence today.
Thank you very much, Hugo. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for the honor and the excitement of joining this program. First of all, I want to thank the various funding sources that have funded the work I'll talk about. And I also want to celebrate our new training program that Hugo just mentioned. As he said, the deadline is a week from today, and we're looking forward to a lot of terrific applications. I'm excited about this program. It is a program that is a partnership, as he mentioned, between Serrapilheira and SAIFR at ICTP. And I want to mention, first of all, Hugo's great contributions to putting this together, but also to mention that this is a journey that began about 40 years ago when Tom Hallam and I organized a meeting at the main center of ICTP in Trieste, Italy, at the Abdus Salam International Center for Theoretical Physics. And so 2 books came out of the early meetings there. We then held a number of regular meetings in years past, and they continue. But these 2 books were the products of those. So I want to also acknowledge the great foresight of Abdus Salam, who founded ICTP, the Nobel laureate, and whom I had the pleasure of working with at the beginning, who decided to broaden ICTP to take into account applications to ecology and environment. So natural history was the cradle of ecology, and it still remains the foundation, going back to great pioneers like Forbes, Clements, and Gleason. But early on, understanding ecological patterns meant understanding the dynamics, for example, the dynamics of the hair lynx cycles in the Arctic. And that meant trying to build quantitative relationships. So ecology evolved, and it continues to do so. Starting in biology, it early on, 100 years ago, built links to mathematics, and then subsequently to physics and to chemistry and to engineering. More recently, obviously, to genomics, and to some extent to the social sciences and humanities. But you notice that I've made this circle smaller. So today's lecture, I want to go through this. I want to begin by talking about the classical advances of great scientists like Volterra and Lotka, move to the computation revolution and what it's meant for this aspect of science. Indeed, mathematics and computing and computation are now speeding advances across biology. Everybody knows about genomics and protein structure, the creation of the vaccines in a short period of time, to evolution and epidemiology, which have been greatly influenced by increased computational abilities, and in immunology and ecology, all which have been important in the current pandemic and dealing with it. And then I want to move from that to talk about prospects for the future, which to me will mean taking that small circle and making it bigger. And I will try to make the argument to you why we need to build bigger links with the social sciences and the humanities. So in ecology, mathematical approaches have a long history. I showed you Volterra's picture before. Volterra was a great mathematician. He was the president of the Accademia Lincei in Italy. Most of his contributions were in fundamental mathematics, integral equations, and the like. But his work on species interactions and ecological communities still influences our work today. And there was other basic theory that I'll touch on in demography and life history theory and evolution and in behavioral ecology. And from that have been the applications of these approaches to a variety of problems, which you'll see discussed in the book Applied Mathematical Ecology that I showed you before, in infectious diseases, about which I'll say more today, in ecotoxicology, the effects of toxic substances in the environment, in fisheries and harvesting theory, in conservation and reserve design, extremely important in Brazil, in bioeconomics and social systems, and more recently in climate change. So let me take you through those in slightly more detail. Demography has its roots with great demographers like John Grount in the 17th century, who were studying the growth largely of the human population. Actually, technically, demography really means the human population, but we often apply it to non-human populations. Mathematical evolutionary theory is also an old subject. The great names there were J.B.S. Haldane, Ronald Fisher, and Sewell Wright, who developed the mathematical theory originally in the context of plant breeding, but also to understand evolution more generally. I've already mentioned the dynamics of interacting species, the work of Volterra and Lotka. And we're becoming increasingly aware that models of the dynamics of infectious diseases have played a fundamental role in their management. For example, classically in vaccination strategies, but with COVID-19, there are many dimensions of the problem. This is a paper we recently published in Science, led by my student, Shadi Sadroy, but with a number of other collaborators, talking about what's to be expected in the dynamics of COVID-19 over the next 5 years. And this relies heavily on mathematical approaches. And in many dimensions, and projecting how many cases there will be, and the importance that we've recognized as never before of asymptomatic transmission, of viral evolution and what that might be, of the influence of things like social distancing and mask wearing, and of course vaccination. And most interestingly, perhaps, in a novel dimension, is the social dynamics of vaccine hesitancy and mask wearing. Modeling has played a fundamental part in all aspects of this problem that we treat them in that paper. So we're seeing an increasing awareness of things that we already knew were important. Similar successes I will mention have characterized resource management, for example, fisheries and reserve design. And now climate change research relies heavily on modeling approaches. So those are many of the classical dimensions with modern updating of the mathematical theory of ecology and environment. To me, in addressing these problems, three grand challenges arise. One of them is understanding what makes the systems we rely on robust and resilient in preventing collapses and critical transition. For example, is climate change destabilizing ecosystems? These are fundamental questions. I'll say a bit more about that. Related to that is the question of how do the patterns at macroscopic levels, from everything like bacterial biofilms and bird flocks to the dynamics of human societies and the biosphere, how do the macroscopic features emerge from the microscopic details, and how do we scale from the smallest to the largest? As an example, can we predict the range shifts and extinctions, say, of fish species under climate change by understanding how individual fish will, and I should say also fishermen, will respond to climate change? And perhaps most fundamentally, in their growingly interconnected world, is how do we deal with problems of the commons? Everything from insurance arrangements to international agreements. So I will touch on all of those things. The basic issue is that from physical systems, like a gas or a liquid put under pressure or with a change in temperature, to biological systems, macroscopic features emerge from microscopic interactions. Makes these systems what we call complex adaptive systems. And the patterns we see at the large scales don't depend on every little detail at the fine scale. That's what allows us to do science. So understanding that is crucial to sustainability. Ecosystems and the biosphere are, as I mentioned, complex adaptive systems, like these bird flocks here. I will run a video of this flock of starlings and one hawk that you'll see over Rome. These fantastic patterns in which individual units, individual agents are interacting locally and evolve. And I don't mean just in a genetic sense, based on the outcomes of those interactions. And so you can see these patterns that emerge, and fantastic patterns. But not only ecological systems, but obviously also the socioeconomic systems with which they are interconnected and interlinked are complex adaptive systems. We all make our individual decisions. We all have our own priorities. And sometimes that's for the good, but sometimes that creates the problems, the so-called tragedy of the commons that Garrett Hardin introduced, an issue to which I will return. In systems of this sort, sudden transitions can happen. They're widespread. I recommend to you Martin Scheffer's book, Critical Transitions in Nature and Society, now several years old, that documents this in all sorts of systems, from ecological systems to social systems. And I should point out that together with Scheffer, we've actually published some work. We look for these early warning signals in our physiological states. When you go to a doctor and get an electrocardiogram or an electroencephalogram, the doctor is looking for signals, not that you're ill, but that you are getting close to some sort of bad event, whether it is a heart attack or a stroke or a migraine headache or an epileptic fit. We look in the ECGs and EEGs for these early warning signals. Can we find those early warning signals for ecological systems? Can we find them for social systems? Can we detect tipping points before they happen? Microscopic studies show that there are potential tipping points and alternative stable states in microbial systems. But we also know that there may be there, as in Tim Glenton's work, in climate systems. And that's something that's a great cause of worry. And in fisheries, we know that fisheries collapse and other species. And maybe in our societies, and that's a great concern to us. So can we detect these early warning signals? Can we see what's going wrong, for example, in our democracies, and when the systems that we rely on are in danger of collapse? So let me give you an ecological example. This is a former collaborator and colleague of mine, now passed away 40 years ago, Robert Whitaker. The diagram on the left is his version of what used to be called the Holdridge diagram, which demonstrates that if you know what the average temperature is in an area and the average precipitation, you have a pretty good idea of what kind of vegetation, whether it's tropical rainforest or deciduous forest or tundra, you can predict fairly well. Now, there is some uncertainty, some fuzz around the edges of these lines, but in particular at the boundaries, one will see what we call multiple stable states. That is, in particular temperature and precipitation regimes, there may be two possible outcomes. We may get temperate deciduous forest, or we may get grassland. We may get tropical forest, or we may get savannas. So together with my student, former student now, Carla Staver, who's a professor at Yale, and Sally Archibald, the South African ecologist, we've been studying this phenomenon in semi-arid regions. And this is Carla on the left and Sally on the right. And as you can see, if you look at global maps that comes from satellite imagery, MODIS imagery, you'll see that there are areas that are projected to be deterministic savanna regions, and they are. And there are areas that are, by the Whitaker sort of diagram, expected to be deterministic forest, and there are. But then there are these bistable regions that could go either way, could be savanna or could be forest. They're obviously at the boundaries between these two regions. And why is that? Why is that bistability? Well, one of the main reasons for it is the role of fire. And if you look at the areas where fire is present and where fire is absent, you can see a big difference in percent of tree cover. To be more specific about it, what happens is that savannas and grasses burn, but that doesn't destroy the grasses. They regrow, but it may inhibit forest trees from advancing to adult stage. And that keeps the system in a grassland situation. If fire is high, we'll get grassland-dominated systems. As fire is suppressed, we will get tree-dominated, forest-dominated systems. And in the middle, between them, we could get either. So in modeling this, we had to first understand the rate at which saplings transition to adults. We can derive that from data, but also from mechanistically from fire percolation models. And what we find is that it is what physicists and mathematicians would call a percolation process, namely, as we increase the level of grass, which would be in response to decreased precipitation, the probability of fire increases, and it increases dramatically. And the amount of burn area has this relationship to grass. So we modeled this. And this thing in the upper right is the inverse of what I just showed you. This is the rate at which saplings progress to adult trees. And as you can see, as you increase the level of grass, thereby increasing the level of fire, you get this sudden transition in which beyond a certain amount, the saplings just don't advance to become adult trees. Now, given the shortness of time, I won't say too much about this model, but we divide the landscape up into grass, saplings, and trees, and allow transitions largely due to trees depositing propagules on the grassland that grow into adult trees. But the critical term here is this omega of G, which is the rate at which saplings advance to become adult trees. And that reflects this relationship in the upper right. The other key term is this rate at which grass is converted into saplings, which is proportional to the amount of grass, but also proportional to the number of trees, which drop seedlings. So this is the simplest model. We've considered a lot of advances on this, which I won't go into today. But the crucial thing is, when you analyze this, you can see that there are multiple stable states, that when precipitation is high, then there's very little fire, and the system is forest dominated, so the level of grass is low. When precipitation is low, we get a grass-dominated system. In between, we get this bistability, either a grass-dominated system or a forest-dominated system with the potential to flip between us. So what we learned from this is, sorry about that, what we learned from this is a diagram of this sort, which says at high precipitation levels, we have a forest-dominated system. At low precipitation levels, we have a grass-dominated system. And as we get in this intermediate region, we get bistability. If we get close to this edge, the system can easily be pushed from one to the other. That's what you see in the lower diagram. And I thank Martin Scheffer. This diagram is modified from his. book. So we learned that the responses to changes in rainfall status will be rapid. There will be threshold transitions, which are not easy to reverse. And as SAIFR points out in his book, we see similar phenomena for other ecological systems like shallow lakes, for the outbreak of pest populations, and perhaps even for things like the circulation patterns in the ocean. Many such transitions have characteristic signals. This cartoon here of a ball sitting on a landscape gives us an idea. If I push the ball up here, it'll come back rapidly. But as this landscape gets shallower and shallower, the rate at which it returns will become less and less until one loses the well entirely and the ball leaves the well. The rate at which it returns has slowed down. That's called critical slowing down. And that's often identified as an early warning indicator that systems are about to change. It's associated with increasing variance in the system, increasing autocorrelation, and maybe flickering from one state to another. So this is a very exciting area, the possibility of looking for early warning signals, not only for the system I just described, but for a wide variety of ecological systems and maybe physical and sociological systems. A warning that this is not a universal. Such signals are not ubiquitous. They depend upon the kind of transition. Imagine a ball rolling along a table, getting close to the edge. It's going to fall off at some point, but we get no local indicators that anything's changed, no slowing down. And if you're interested in reading about this, there's a large literature developing on when these early warning signals work and when they don't. Don't have time to get into it today, but we're doing a lot of work on that. So that's the issue of robustness and resilience to critical transitions. What about the scaling pattern? For example, illustrated by these fantastic patterns on giraffe coat or zebra coats, you would see the same thing that arise from local rules. Again, a large literature in mathematical biology about the emergence of pattern, which are trying to do other things like the distribution of species and the patterns of range shifts in response to climate change, biodiversity loss. Most general ability, as I mentioned at the beginning, has to focus on the macroscopic properties, even though recognizing that control of these rests at lower levels of organization. When you go to make a cup of tea, when you go to boil the water that's necessary, you don't worry about trying to predict what every molecule is going to do, even though you recognize, as in this diagram on the right, which is a substance under pressure, that the phase transition that results when water boils or under other conditions when it freezes depends upon large numbers of individual interactions, of the behaviors of individual molecules, for example. Well, the same thing applies to trying to understand those bird flocks or what's going on in human societies. It's all the behavior of individuals, but many of them allowing us to develop appropriate statistical mechanics. This idea has been applied in the development of a lot of individual-based models. For example, beginning with the work of Dan Botkin and Hank Schugert, and more recently, Steve Pacala, one can grow forests, as you see on the left, by growing individual trees in response to sorts of conditions in the Whittaker diagram, namely temperature and precipitation, and take into account their growth rates, their ability to shade each other out, to disperse seeds, and to build individual-based models, as you see on the right, of different tree species. That's what the different colors represent. Now, when you do this, what you hope is that the general patterns, the relative abundances of different species can be predicted, but not the individual locations of individual trees. In fact, they change over time. So this is a kind of statistical mechanics through simulation. And when you extend this out to the global level, vegetation models of this sort have been successful in explaining global patterns, but not individual species abundances, We can predict where there'll be desert. We can predict where there'll be grassland, but not exactly what species will be there. So remember that as we try to predict what's going to happen to tree species in the face of climate change. The same thing has been applied to marine systems. This is a standard NPZ, nutrient phytoplankton, zooplankton model of the oceans, but with different nutrients, different phytoplankton species, different zooplankton species, and largely the work of Mick Follows. And again, this approach has been used to make predictions about the global distribution, not of individual species, but of types of species like diatoms or large eukaryotes, or multiple species of the genus Prochlorococcus, for example. So fantastically successful work by Follows and his group. We've also been applying these sorts of ideas to bird flocks, to fish schools like you see on the left, and to herds of reindeer and other ungulates, as you see in the lower left. The bird flocks you saw before, the fish schools, individual fish are moving. Nobody would want to predict where every fish is going to be. But if we can understand the collective behaviors, then we've come a long way in understanding the how to scale from the microscopic to the macroscopic. And similar approaches can examine collective decision-making in human societies. So that's how we do the scaling. Look, in the last part of the lecture, I've talked about classical advances. I've talked about the power of computation. And now I want to talk about what I think one of the great challenges for our new training program will be, which is adding the interface with the social sciences and the humanities, managing the local commons, developing international agreements. Most of us would agree that scientific consensus on many issues like temperature rises, on many core environmental issues is strong. Not only that it's going to happen, but that humans are responsible. But still, we haven't taken adequate action to address them. Why? It's not because we don't understand the physics, the chemistry, the biology, but rather it's the willingness of people and governments to make commitments to the public good. Why haven't we done that? Why aren't we doing that now? How do we cooperate in finding solutions that benefit everyone? This is now a somewhat dated study, but it will make my point. This was a multiple country study, 3 very different countries in terms of their political systems, the US, China, and Sweden. And as you can see, in Sweden and in China, just look at this figure on the upper right, there is almost universal agreement that humans have affected the temperature increase, and similarly, that we can do something about it, and we need to do something about it. In the US, there was a majority, but only 73%. What accounts for that difference? Look at it a different way. In 2008, this is a study in the US, about a bare majority, about 51% of the people were either alarmed or concerned about climate change. In 2010, that had dropped substantially to 39%. By 2016, it was back up to 45%, and today it's back up to about where it was, or at least pre-pandemic, it was back up to about where it was in 2008. So what went on? Well, in 2008, 2009, we had a financial crisis, and people stopped being as concerned about the longer-term effects of climate change, and so we have to solve the financial system first. We've got to get the economy moving. We'll worry about climate change later. So 2 things in the slides I showed you. In this one, the effects of discounting and the intrusion of multiple factors into the system. In the previous one, the role of political and social systems in shaping attitudes. Let me give you another example, which is more current. We're doing work on face masks. I actually don't know where Brazil would fit on this slide. I don't see it listed, but this is the willingness to wear masks in the face of the pandemic. and this is going from last May through August, but it could be continued today. You'll notice there are a group of countries, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong. Anybody who's traveled there knows that even in the flu epidemics, there is a willingness to wear masks, to protect oneself and to protect others. In other countries, and that's of course continued, in other countries like Sweden, Norway, and Finland, there is no such tradition, and it hasn't changed. If you go there, you'll see that the people are still not wearing masks. And then there are a group of countries, largely Western European countries like France, Germany, Italy, Spain, but also the US and Canada, in which there was no such tradition, but there has been a transformation. So just like with attitudes towards climate change, attitudes towards social distancing and wearing face masks can be influenced by others, whether they are your friends and neighbors or your government. So we don't get back up to the levels of the Asian countries, but there's been a definite transformation, a critical transition for the good, similar to what I was discussing before. These are social attitudes or social norms, and we know that attitudes can change rapidly. Foot binding, as you see in the lower left, was a long-term tradition in China among the upper classes, and then suddenly disappeared overnight. In the US, at least, and in many other countries, I don't know the situation in Brazil, there have been dramatic changes in smoking in public places, in attitudes towards racial equality, gender equality, climate change I've already mentioned, and maybe the pandemic. Paul Ehrlich and I, 15 years ago, wrote a paper about the evolution of norms and how they could change rapidly. The central issues are issues of behavior and culture, equity, intergenerational and intragenerational, public goods and common pool resources and how we protect them, how we get cooperation in the commons, the role of social norms and institutions like foot binding, and the role of leadership and how we develop consensus. The problem is we discount the future. The food looks good today. We'll worry about the consequences of eating it later. And this has been a central issue, for example, in the Stern review on the economics of climate change. But we also discount the interests of others. So far, we don't have to put up with flying long distances with someone next to us talking on a telephone, but it's been proposed. It's an issue of a public good, namely quiet on the plane. How do we protect ourselves, others, and future generations against the consequences of our overuse of resources? We can buy insurance. That's the first steps towards cooperative solution. And there are various kinds of insurance, no time to talk about them. We can develop cooperation and pro-sociality, meaning caring about others. We can try to shift social norms and public attitudes, for example, towards vaccine acceptance or mask wearing. Eventually, when we look for cooperation, some of these principles become ingrained in our laws and our religions, but ultimately in international agreements. As an example, Dan Rubenstein and Avinash Dixon and I have worked on pastoralism and the sharing of grazing grounds. Herdsmen in East Africa graze their cattle. If one herdsman is having a bad season in terms of weather conditions, he might ask his neighbor, "Can I send my cattle to graze on your ground?" The neighbor says, "Why should I let you do that?" And he said, "Well, next year the situations might be reversed. You can send your cattle to graze on my ground." And so we've analyzed this. We built a model looking at the payoffs if I do and do not send my cattle, if they are or are not accepted. And I'm going to give you, I'm not going to build the model here, but I'm going to tell you the process. Because I think the same thing applies to almost any of the problems dealing with public goods that we are confronted. The first thing one does is to compute what the social optimum would be. If someone were in charge who was shifting cattle, This becomes an optimization problem. But then we have to ask, what if there's nobody in charge and it's just individual herdsmen? Then it becomes a game theoretic problem. We move from optimization to game theory, and we ask, is this a Nash equilibrium? Is it stable in a game theoretic sense? And if it's not, we don't give up. Maybe the other herdsman says, well, I won't accept all of your cattle, but you can send me 10 cows. And I know that means next year I can only send you 10. And we look for the best solution of that type. That's called a second best solution. And it's a constrained optimization problem. What's the best solution we get, given that it would still be a Nash equilibrium? Overall, the challenge is to maintain public goods. And I should mention that one consideration that should be brought in here is that the other herdsman might be the father of my son's daughter, I'm sorry, my son's wife. And he may say, well, I normally wouldn't do this, but because I care about you, I'll do it. So pro-sociality is important. So all of these factors come in. All of these can be built into mathematical models. A pro-social world's a better place to be. And as Dixit and I show in a paper, but following on work of Herb Gintis, Errol Akçe, and others, we can actually select for pro-sociality. And the reason being, if I want my children to live in a more pro-social world, because it's a better place for them to be, I'd be willing to contribute to an educational system that would teach pro-sociality. Public goods problems are widespread in socioeconomic and ecological contexts. Like you see on the left, fishermen and oil rigs in competition with each other, but even tumor cells, which are growing at cost to the whole organism. That's a breakdown of the commons. That's a breakdown of the public goods. William Forster Lloyd introduced the notion of the commons a century, 2 centuries ago, and it was picked up by Garrett Hardin, who talked about the tragedy of the commons. And for Hardin, the solution was mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. And what he meant was that there'd be a role for regulation and for government. But Lynn Ostrom, late colleague and collaborator, won the Nobel Prize for demonstrating that the maintenance of cooperation in small societies could arise from the bottom up. And we've got to begin there to get shared and mutually agreed upon norms. Fairness norms can provide the mutual coercion mutually agreed upon. A variety of collaborators here on withdrawals, and I'm going to cut this short because I'm running out of time. I will pass over the mathematical models in the next slides. But the idea is that individuals can withdraw fish from the ocean or water from an aquifer, and can do so either at their own selfish rates or at the social optimum rate, as if everybody were in this together, or at some second best solution. So I'm going to skip the model, but just say that what we find is that there are multiple stable states, that if you can get the number of cooperators above a threshold level, you can get a better world. And that principle applies to agreements like the Kyoto Accords on climate change, etc. Lynn Ostrom talked about a polycentric approach built on her work for coping with climate change, building local agreements, for example, between among the South American countries, between the US and China, those would be building blocks rather than trying to get 200 countries all at once to agree on principles. With Avinash Dixit and my student Andrew Tillman, we've looked at models, again, given the time, I'm going to skip over the details, but in which individuals can either contribute to a public good within their own group. That's what those patches represent. Those are the polycentric centers of Lynn Ostrom's discussion, or they can use the resources for themselves. And we've built a model that I'm going to skip on to talk about, but in which one can begin to look at these interactions. And finally, in dealing with the issue of decarbonization, which is of growing importance, we've been building models to look at whether individuals will accept a decarbonized world. We have individuals who have attitudes and opinions towards these issues. They belong to groups which have their own norms and attitudes. Individuals will change their attitudes towards whether they're willing to wear masks or whether they're willing to accept solar power based on what their neighbors are doing, based on the groups to which they belong. On a longer time scale, those groups may change their minds, or individuals may change their membership in groups. So this is a new use of mathematical modeling. And we've applied this also at the global level in trying to understand how one can get cooperation in dealing with climate change. So let me summarize. Modeling of collective decision-making, I think, represents a new frontier in theoretical ecology. Understanding the propagation of ideas, how social norms arise and how they spread, and how we can achieve collective action. Attitudinal shifts on things like climate change or mask wearing affect action. And in human societies, just as in the bird flocks, there may be only a few leaders and many followers. And that is both a problem and also an opportunity for shifting norms. Sudden shifts in attitudes are given momentum by large numbers of followers. And environmental action has to take this potential volatility into account. Ecological systems and socioeconomic systems, as I mentioned at the beginning, are complex adaptive systems. To approach that, we need to develop an appropriate statistical mechanics that allows us to relate the microscopic to the macroscopic, ranging everywhere from ecological systems to the coupled socioeconomic and ecological systems that define the biosphere. We have to understand the emergence of pattern on multiple scales and indicators of impending critical transitions. But I think most critically, most challengingly, we need to find pathways to governance in the multi-scale commons. How do we achieve action on the pandemics, on climate change, and on population growth, the other great challenges of our day? Theoretical ecology has a rich history. I started with demography and behavior, the study of ecosystems, infectious diseases, and resource management, and even the coupling with general circulation models and the understanding of collective behavior in animal groups. Moving forward, we need to address new challenges. This is a special issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that we edited a few years back, which tried to bring together economists and ecologists and modelers to address the challenges that are now facing our societies. Issues of ethics and equity. These don't sound like mathematical topics, but they have to find their way into the mathematical models. How societies grow and form opinions and attitudinal shifts. The role of pro-sociality and problems of the commons. The new training program with which I began this lecture, with which Hugo introduced me, will need to span, as I tried to argue in this paper, from the classical challenges to the modern ones, to allow us to cross scales, to cross disciplines, to achieve collective motion and collective action in the global commons. Thank you very much for your patience. So I think I'll stop sharing now and turn things.
Thank you, Simon. It's so fascinating. I have to say, I'm sitting here listening to you, and it's absolutely fascinating. And I want to, we have quite a few questions. I can understand because your lectures really spans from math to ecology and puts it all together. It's exactly in line with what we're trying to achieve here, I have to say. So, the training program that we're launching today actually is exactly trying to really give to young students the capacity to grasp these things in a wide manner the way Simon just described. And so I guess it's clear to everybody that he goes from math to social sciences, ecology, and behavior, and this is, and so we need to basically stop learning science in a very, very separated, different fields and different ways. But let me go to the questions, because there are many. So I don't know if we have time to ask all of them. So I already apologize for that. I'll try to take them as they come. I will first have a question to you, Simon, by Adenilson Arcanjo. His question is, are there situations in which biological questions give rise to new mathematics? That is, situation in which, in order to advance in biological knowledge, we need to work on some mathematical problem that has not been studied before.
Yeah, I mean, classically, there are many examples of this. The whole subject of statistics undoubtedly got a great boost from addressing questions, for example, in genetics, but in demography and the like. And we are finding, as we turn to one problem after another, either new fields of mathematics or extensions of old fields. Game theory has gotten tremendous boost from addressing evolutionary questions. It really began in, well, there are early examples of game theoretic questions posed, for example, by Ronald Fisher in evolutionary theory, but then it developed in economics, and there's a partnership that's gone back and forth. And I will say that in working with economists, because I thought we had to confront the interface, I realized the similarity of the disciplines, and therefore the similarity of the questions. Dynamical systems theory certainly didn't begin with biology, but new questions have come up. Pattern formation, Alan Turing's example of how pattern arises in a developing organism introduced new directions in theory of partial differential equations, having questions that were similar to ones that are asked elsewhere, but having to do with the role of double diffusion and things of that sort. So we are seeing whole areas like statistics and game theory, which have gotten a lot of their initial push from questions of biology. But we certainly see a lot of new phenomena coming in biological systems, new sorts of bifurcations, etc., that are drive percolation theory, spatial stochastic processes. So I think mathematics has as much to gain from biology as biology does from mathematics. It's particularly exciting.
All right. So Luisa Ramirez is doing some somewhat similar question from the physics viewpoints. Do you think we need to learn new physics to understand all of these new questions you have addressed, or do you think that the physics we know, with the physics we know, we'll be able to propose robust model to answer them the questions, I guess?
Well, I certainly think that everything we know about physics continues to hold true. We're not going to, but we're going to have to put things together in new ways. And for the physicists, I think the place to begin is a paper more than 50 years ago, approximately 50 years ago, by my late colleague at Princeton, Phil Anderson, who wrote a paper called "More is Different," in which he argued that that in order to study complex systems, it was more than just knowing what the parts were. It was more than just knowing what the laws were at the microscopic level. One had to understand these questions of emergence and the new principles that emerge. So, to the extent that complexity and understanding complexity is a new science, it's going to require it's forced new corrections in physics. There's an Institute for Complex Adaptive Materials that looks at these questions. Lots of inspiration for biology. And of course, putting the physics together with the biology and all the extra nonlinearities that arise, I think are driving new questions in physics. So everything you know about physics still holds true, but there are a lot of questions that classical physics does not address.
Okay. Another questions. The questions are just so many. It's just.
I don't have to leave at the hour, so
I'm sorry, but we won't have time to ask all of the questions. I'm saying it now, but and the lecture is very intense, so be aware that it's on YouTube. You could see it again, because I think it's something that one has to see slowly, and because it's a lot of information. But let me ask you the question from Leticia Lopez. What are the obstacles to put together biological, mathematical, and social sciences? Do you think researchers are too much attached to the comfort fields?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and that's a question that we that the training program has to.
Exactly.
So first of all, let me say at the start that we're trying to train interdisciplinary scientists. We're trying to be interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary ourselves. That having been said, I feel firmly that it's important for everyone to become expert in at least one discipline, to bring something to the table. But we also have to break down the barriers, and some disciplines have done this more effectively than others. Obviously, we've got to teach people how to work with others, to know whom to trust, because you can't be an expert in everything. And also, to the extent possible, to learn multiple disciplines oneself. I can say that I began as a mathematician. I became chairman of my department of ecology at Cornell, and I asked them at that time to move my entire appointment over, because I wanted the work that I did to be judged by the area of application. Most disciplinary departments, whether it's mathematics or physics, although physics has been much better than most other disciplines, or economics, look for advances within their own disciplines. So it is a real impediment within most institutions, especially of higher learning. We've got to find ways to value the work that people do in taking what they've learned and applying it to other fields. Now, we have examples of this, of course, but the mathematicians like Kenneth Arrow, who have become the great economists, have done so by becoming economists. And so I think one really has to make a decision to transform oneself and be judged by by their ability to solve problems.
Right.
But it is a great challenge.
It is a great challenge, and I have to stress again that I guess the idea that we're having with the training that we're launching is exactly that. So this is actually the first time I discussed with Simon. It was exactly along these lines. Trying to train young people to tackle the different questions. Of course, as Simon mentioned, you can be an expert on everything. But if very early on you just learn to see things in a broader way, you definitely would have a different way of looking at things. Let me go. I'll try to join some questions that I think are somewhat similar. We have questions from Gabriel Luis Moreira, Mariana Devo, and Fernanda Timoteo. So the three questions goes like this: how could we change habits from common cooperation in a society that aims for individualism? That's the first one.
Could you repeat that one?
How can we change habits for common cooperation in a society that aims for individualism? Mm-hmm. The second question is, how can we relate this with informing society about the risk of policies that go against science? And the third one is, can these models illuminate this change and reach society broadly?
Yeah, so let me work backwards as best I can. Those are great questions. We're getting a real test of this the role of mathematics and modeling in influencing society. We know there's some areas in which people have been very influenced by modeling of various kinds. For example, although it's losing its influence, the role of polling leading up to presidential elections in our various countries and things of that sort hasn't worked that well, actually. But we're seeing a tremendous role, and to some extent, acceptance of modeling in dealing with the pandemic, in terms of what percentage of the population would have to be vaccinated, whom should be vaccinated, those sorts of issues, and prediction. And I think the predictions have turned out to be remarkably accurate. I understand the early predictions coming out of the UK would be that there'd be 2 million deaths in the US. Well, hopefully we're not going to get to 2 million, but we've got 500,000, which is the same order of magnitude roughly, and we're not done. And what the model said is if you don't change what you're doing, you're going to have 2 million deaths. And so hopefully that's influenced some of the changes. So we've got to find better ways to get and the models have played a role also, of course, in climate change discussions. We've got to find better ways. We can't overstate the value of the models. We know there's uncertainty, and that's always a problem in communicating to the public. Decision makers want you to, our former president Harry Truman once said, "Give me a one-armed economist," because economists were always saying, on the one hand this, on the other hand this, and so scientists are used to giving their uncertainty when decision makers want to be told what to do. We have to realize that a lot of this also, it's not only uncertainty, but social preferences. So I think we're doing a better job of getting modeling into, but this feeds back into the previous question, which has to do with the distrust of science in general, not just in the public eye, but in some governments. Even in the United States, on a state-by-state basis, some governments are much more persuaded by scientific argument than others. This is not just modeling, but science in general. I think this is one of the great challenges for our society. I think that for our societies, I think that our national academies recognize that this is the great challenge, is that although scientists are among the most trusted in the world by people, the level of trust has gone down. And we know some of the reasons for that, some of it for political reasons, but we've got to combat it and restore trust. And of course, scientists have to remember, and this is very difficult, how to keep their scientific opinions and their political opinions separate. And I say that, going back to the previous point, that there are some aspects of predicting what we ought to do. For example, the trade-offs between opening up economies in the face of the pandemic. Some of those issues are scientific. They're all informed by science, but the decision as to what risks to take may have to do with individual societal discount rates and things of that sort. And then going back to your first question, which was, how do we get better cooperation? I'm just in the midst of organizing a special issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of the United States on the dynamics of political polarization, because I think that's key here too. And in that, we address questions like the role of social media and the role of political systems in shaping political polarization. Political polarization is throughout the world, is making cooperation more and more difficult. But I firmly believe in Lynn Ostrom's polycentricity. Mainly, you got to start locally and build cooperation and make those building blocks to build up from there. I don't know the answer to it entirely, because we're facing societies in which truth no longer, never mind science, truth no longer is respected to the degree we need it to be and the degree it used to be. But I think cooperation is going to have to begin from the bottom up. We're going to have to change social norms in terms of attitudes of pro-sociality, people caring not only about the others in their family, in their neighborhood, but at the global level. We've got to get across the message. And the pandemic should have been the ideal place to do it, that just making sure that the number of cases in Rio is small is not going to protect you if you don't reduce the number of cases throughout the world, because pandemics don't know any geographic boundaries, and neither does climate change.
Yeah, totally agree. All right, so just one or maybe two more questions, and then we'll just close this session. The question from Fernando Arras: how does AI, machine learning, could help researchers in what you do?
Yeah, well, so this is not an area of my expertise, but I can tell you that machine learning and artificial intelligence more generally are playing increasingly important role. There's a new institute in which we have some funding that called C3.ai, and Google has also been involved with this, Google, Microsoft, all of them, in trying to especially deal with the current pandemic with deep learning and big data and artificial intelligence. I think these have tremendous potential to play a role. Unfortunately, they can play a role for the good and for the bad, but let's hope we can develop it for the good. It's already playing a big role, though, in dealing with data analysis coming out of the pandemic and developing algorithms to deal with.
Last question, Simon, because it's so many. I have the from Kaique Silva. What are the most complex parameters to model concerning social and population analysis? Is there any variable which is often poorly predicted? What is the role of randomness in all of these models?
Yeah, well, so those are great questions. First of all, in general, when you're looking at a model, the most troublesome parameters are likely to be the ones that are nonlinear, that involve more than one player. So, for example, if you're building even a simple model of a fishery, you have models of which aspects in which individuals age, etc. But the crucial thing is that two individuals have to come together and produce offspring. That's the nonlinear part of the model. That drives the dynamics. So in general, those are the things that are most difficult. We have a very poor understanding, I think, of how individuals make their own decisions. We know, I would direct one back to the great work of the Nobel laureate Herbert Simon in trying to understand how people make decisions, the notions of bounded rationality. We have incomplete information. We have incomplete capacity to make decisions. And so people make very irrational decisions. They evaluate risks in incoherent ways, and they make decisions that don't seem to make sense. Certainly not. The whole idea, sometimes for the good, the whole idea of pro-sociality doesn't make as much sense to economists as one might think. So I could give a whole lecture on this topic. So I think understanding why individuals or when they're willing to do things in the collective good, how they discount the future, these are all the sorts of things in which modelers and ecologists have to work more closely with social scientists. Most of the studies in social science are done either in very limited laboratory conditions or by questionnaires, which are very problematical because of the way the questions are asked. So I think human decision making and the willingness of humans to cooperate and care about others is the great unknown. The things that are going on in my own country, what we saw in the Capitol on January 6th, nobody predicted that it could get to that level. That's an inadequate understanding of human behavior, and why many of the things that are happening in my country and other countries are just mysteries to me. I think that those, indeed, as the question suggests, are the great uncertainties that face us in modeling.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Simon. I have to say, in Brazil as well, we are in the land of uncertainty for the moment. I want to mention that during Simon's talk, he mentioned Carlos Staver and Pinsky and Kausin, and they all will be PIs and teachers during the course that we will have in July. We'll have a course that's online this year for obvious reasons, but the course aims to be, of course, in person as of 2022. We hope that this will be possible. All information that you want to find, you can find them on the Serrapilheira webpage or the ICTP webpage, and the deadline to start the inscription, and remember, we'll give preference to the first 500 proposals, is on March 9th. With this, Simon, I want to really thank you so much. It was a very inspiring lecture. Again, this will be on our YouTube channel, so you can see this again as much as one wants. It's a great honor to have you with us, and I hope that you will be working with us and advising us again for a long time. Thank you very much, Simon, for your time.
I hope so as well. The honor is mine for being able to help you in this terrific effort. Thank you for your leadership, Hugo.
Thank you, Simon. Bye-bye.